Special Tribunal has set aside the controversial Gauteng Education COVID-19 PPE contracts for deep cleaning in schools, totaling 431 million rand. About 49 service providers hired to sanitize schools involved in the contracts have been ordered to pay back all profits with interest, as the SIU found that the contracts were illegally awarded. For reaction to this, we now speak to Executive Director at Corruption Watch, Karam Singh. Mr. Singh, thank you so much for your time this morning. Just your initial reaction to what we found out yesterday from the SIU and the Special Tribunal.
Yeah, this is a very exciting development. We've known about issues of irregular procurement for a long time in relationship to PPE and other responses by government to the pandemic. The issue of fogging is something which has been exposed for quite some time. It's a story that's been in the public domain, particularly something that Mark Haywood has been writing about in the Daily Maverick. It seems as if fogging has been a scheme colluded between officials and service providers to look for a response which is not required. The World Health Organization and others have said that fogging is not an appropriate response to deal with the pandemic. So what we see is hundreds of millions of rand have been spent on decontamination, when in actuality the actual costs of that decontamination is significantly less, but even so that it's not something which is an appropriate response to deal with COVID-19. So these were irregular procurement, and it's a positive development that the SIU has been able to get this judgment in front of their special tribunal.
I mean, you mentioned the issue of irregular procurement, Karam, and we do know that from what we have heard from the Special Tribunal, that some companies and the SIU, some companies actually got these tenders via WhatsApp. Does this really just show how deep the corruption in South Africa runs, that it is so easy for a person to award a company a certain tender, but their processes have actually not been followed?
Absolutely. We also have something called the Central Supplier Database, and in some cases, and that would be a minimum requirement that a service provider to government would need to be listed on that database. And in some cases, these were startup companies that had no track record in this area, and certainly were not listed on that database. We have a deep problem with our procurement system. We have a highly decentralized procurement system, and we know from the SIU reports and even from the findings coming out of the Zondo Commission that procurement has particularly been the area where there's been collusion between corrupt service providers and officials within the state to loot and to irregularly spend public money. So absolutely, procurement has got to be the focus going forward when it comes to trying to address our corruption challenges and to try to put more transparency into the system so that we can pick up these kind of irregular contracts, before the money is spent and laundered out of the country.
Karam, I mean, it's interesting that we have now gotten this outcome that they need to pay this money through back to the SIU. But it still begs the question, how did this actually happen in the first place?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we're getting some of the picture from the final SIU report. The SIU report, identifies officials in the system, and then it talks about a lax system, where officials up and down the line were complicit in this. In some cases, people just looked the other way. But it points to kind of a poor control environment and the fact that, there are deep corruption vulnerabilities, particularly within provincial departments of education, departments of infrastructure and development that sit on significant budgets, and there's just not sufficient oversight either within those departments to ensure that money is spent properly, nor is there sufficient oversight and monitoring within national treasury and within provincial treasuries to pick up on these issues. And that's one of the reasons why Corruption Watch has argued quite strongly that we need a much more transparent system when it comes to public procurement, so that it can be monitored effectively by those who have the mandate to oversight, but even monitored by people like us in civil society, so that we can see that that money is spent properly and we don't have this kind of irregular procurement going forward.
We now know that they need to pay this money back, those that have been implicated in this ruling. What more, though, do you think should actually happen? Specifically, let's start off with these companies that have been found to have not used the right processes to get this tender.
Well, I mean, I think if it can be shown that there was collusion, and it's clear, and that the companies weren't, properly listed, and if the companies even made representations, and that the procurement was done fraudulently, then, there should be a process of blacklisting these types of companies, and blacklisting the individuals associated with these companies from doing business with government in the future. So I think blacklisting is something which is a significant response, and we don't see that happening regularly. We have something called the Restricted Suppliers Database and other databases whereby companies can be sanctioned. I think where there's evidence of criminality, we also would want to see prosecutions. I think that's also critical. But I think, we spend a lot of time talking about prosecutions, and a lot of times we don't focus on asset recovery. So I think it's important for people to understand that recovering the money is also really critical. So I think, that's really where the importance of this judgment lies.
We have heard before, Karam, that, the MEC of Education, Panyazali Sufi in Gauteng, really saying that those that have been found wanting in this case will be held liable. What should happen to those in the Gauteng Department of Education who have actually been implicated in this report? What measures should be put in place?
There needs to be comprehensive disciplinary procedures against these individuals. If there's evidence that they've been involved in criminal conduct, those matters must be referred to the MPA, and they must be prosecuted criminally. But certainly they must be sanctioned by way of discipline within the department. And I think in some cases people will have to lose their jobs because they've been involved in massive irregular spending that's seen huge amounts of money lost. This is taxpayer money. We know that our schools are struggling. We know that our healthcare system is struggling. We just can't afford to lose this kind of money through irregular procurement, let alone fraudulent or criminal procurement. So there has to be accountability. And some of that accountability must also lie with the MEC himself. He's never really come forward and disclosed why the environment that he oversees was so lax, or put his hand up to say that some accountability lies with him and those around him. So, there really is a case to be answered to in the case of Gauteng Education, and I think officials up and down the line who are implicated in this have a case to answer to.
We often see, Karam, we often see people who are implicated in such kind of reports or rulings. They then just resign and nothing really happens to them. If this happens in this case, it would be quite an interesting outcome, wouldn't it?
We often, you're right, and that's a phenomenon that we've seen across the public sector. It's something we see in local government. As soon as there's strong allegations, people resign, and then sure enough, they pop up someplace else in the public service. So, when I talk about blacklisting of companies, we also need to think about, the potential to blacklist individuals from future service within the public sector. And people shouldn't be able to just resign and run away from answering these charges on the basis that they're being pursued because of their employment relationship. So we need a much more robust system to consequence management to try to close those kinds of loopholes that people are able to utilize to avoid facing consequences and answering for their wrongdoings.
Do you think that the SIU would at all be able to recover these monies?
I believe so. It would seem that the companies that have been listed in this case are still in operation. There would be individuals associated with these companies. So one would have to see, what type of assets are in the bank accounts. But we also know from the previous SIU reports that there is a phenomenon of money laundering and money getting dissipated. So that's why why we emphasize the need for more preventative measures to ensure that the money doesn't go out, because once the money's stolen and then it gets distributed amongst friends and families, it does become difficult to recover the money in some cases.
And this really sends out a strong message, Karam, to other government departments.
Absolutely. The Special Tribunal is a very important development. The SIU is a civil recovery agency. Their primary mandate is to go after money which has been irregularly spent. So it's important that we have a mechanism like this in place to identify irregular spending, to freeze assets, and then to recover those assets. So it's a really, really important tool in our broader armory in the fight against corruption.
Executive Director at Corruption Watch, Karam Singh, thank you so much for your time this morning.